Hello there. Tonight we are going to step quietly into a room that smells faintly of wood smoke, damp straw, and just a little bit of goat. The fire has burned low, but it still sighs now and then in the hearth, exhaling heat like an old man muttering in his sleep. There's a pot suspended above it, bubbling something unidentifiable, maybe a soup, maybe laundry water, maybe both. In the flickering shadows, you can just make out a bundle of blankets near the far wall. That's not just one person, by the way, that's the whole family. You probably won't survive the smell, the scandal, or the sheer lack of personal space. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. In a typical medieval home, privacy was about as real as dragons. Everyone shared the same space. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, usually lived in what was known as a crock house, a one-room wooden structure with a thatched roof, dirt floor, and walls that didn't so much keep weather out as gently delay it. There were no bedrooms, no partitions, and certainly no do not disturb signs. The entire household, including the children, elderly relatives, servants, if you were lucky enough to have them, and maybe a few chickens or pigs, if you were unlucky enough, all lived, ate, and slept together in the same open area. This meant that every aspect of daily life happened within view, or at least within earshot of everyone else. Want to be alone with your spouse? That was more a matter of timing than location. You'd wait until the children were asleep, your mother-in-law's snores reached a certain rhythm, and the goat had settled down for the night. Only then, maybe if the wind was right and no one had to use the chamber pot, could you hope for a little intimacy. Quietly, carefully, and preferably facing the wall. Beds weren't really beds as we know them. Most were nothing more than sacks of straw laid out on the floor, often shared by multiple people. A family bed might include not just the married couple, but one or two children, an elderly parent, and perhaps a visiting cousin passing through town. If you were traveling, the situation didn't improve. Inns were few and far between, and their accommodations were, let's say, communal. It wasn't uncommon to be assigned to a bed already occupied by another traveler. A real one, with boots and breath, and possibly head lice. Sharing a mattress with strangers wasn't considered odd, it was just efficient. The idea of personal space hadn't been invented yet, and if you were married and hoped for a private moment with your spouse, you might find yourself negotiating with a stranger over who got which side of the straw. Among the wealthier classes, things were only marginally better. Castles had more rooms, yes, but they weren't exactly cozy. Stone walls trapped cold and echoed noise. Servants slept at the foot of the bed or stood silently in the corners, pretending not to notice anything, but rarely missing a thing. A noble's chamber might be adorned with tapestries, but those were for insulation, not discretion. Curtains, if present, were usually decorative and didn't do much to block sound or curiosity. And in many noble households, the lord's nighttime activities were a matter of public record, literally. Sometimes written down for legal reasons, imagine your bedtime routine being archived by a scribe with a candle and a quill. For monks and nuns, intimacy was a hard no. The rules were strict. Celibacy was expected and deviation was not taken lightly. Monasteries and convents were designed with austerity in mind. No cozy alcoves, no hidden corners, and yet, as human nature tends to do, affection sometimes crept in. Letters survived that hint at romantic longings between brothers and sisters of the cloth, and many convents, interestingly enough, had very high garden walls, for contemplation, obviously, or for whispering behind hedges. Historians still debate whether these walls were spiritual fortifications or just really good hiding places. Let's pause here for an odd fact. In some medieval towns, there were officials whose job it was to count beds. Yes, bed inspectors. Their duties included recording how many people lived in each household, and whether they were sleeping in morally acceptable arrangements. Imagine knocking on a peasant's door and demanding to know if 3 people sleeping in one hay pile were legally compatible. It gives a whole new meaning to household audit. Back among the peasants, there were no priests peeking behind the curtains, largely because there weren't any curtains. Most people understood that privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. And so life went on. Quiet nods, careful glances, an understanding that everyone was doing the best they could with the time and space they had. Love wasn't a candlelit affair. It was an exercise in patience, logistics, and not waking the baby. If that doesn't sound romantic, remember this: despite everything, the noise, the smell, the awkward proximity, people still found ways to connect. Maybe it was a gentle touch while stirring the soup, a smile while mending a tunic, a whispered joke about the neighbor's goat. Tiny moments of closeness tucked between chores and more chores. Let's not forget the animals. Livestock didn't just sleep in the same house, sometimes they slept on the same bedding. Chickens roamed freely, pigs rooted around in the straw, cows were tethered nearby for warmth. This wasn't seen as weird, it was practical. Your animals were valuable and there was no barn, so they stayed close. Very close. There are accounts of couples recounting how during particularly cold nights they found themselves spooning not just each other, but a pleasantly warm sheep. Love, after all, is nothing if not adaptable. And speaking of adaptation, traveling nobles often encountered situations where even their status couldn't shield them from awkward sleep arrangements. Chronicles record grumbling aristocrats sharing beds with lesser men during long journeys. Not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was freezing in a cold hole. You take that side, I'll take this one, and please keep your sword to yourself. This was the real medieval bedroom part, shelter part, dormitory part, livestock pen. Yet despite all of that, people managed. They married, they had children, they loved. Not always with poetry, not always with comfort, but often with genuine affection. Because even in a room crowded with noise and stink and clucking chickens, someone's hand might find yours under the blanket. And for one quiet moment, even in a world that offered no privacy, no warmth, and no peace, there could be love. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed alone or not, stretch your legs across the mattress. Breathe in, notice the silence, the softness, the sheer miracle of sleeping without hooves next to your head. And maybe if you listen closely, you'll hear the echo of another time, one where love had to squeeze into the space between a snoring uncle and a basket of eggs. And still somehow it made room. If you thought finding time for intimacy in a one-room cottage was complicated, wait until the church gets involved. Because in medieval Europe, the biggest third wheel in your relationship wasn't your mother-in-law, the baby, or the pig, it was God. And he had opinions, lots of them, particularly about what you could do when you could do it, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying any of it. The church's influence on medieval life was absolute, not just on Sundays, not just during weddings or funerals, but every single day from sunrise to curfew. It wasn't just that your priest knew your name, he probably knew your bedding habits. Spiritual guidance often came with very specific advice about the timing, frequency, and purpose of marital relations. The general message, reproduction, good pleasure, highly suspect. Let's start with the calendar. You'd think intimacy would be a private matter, but the church turned it into a logistical nightmare. There were entire sections of the year when getting close to your spouse was not just discouraged, it was outright forbidden. No touching on Sundays, obviously. That's the Lord's Day, but also not on Fridays because penance. Wednesdays were iffy, and don't even think about it during Lent. That's 40 days off the table. Advent, another 40 days. Then there were feast days, fast days, saint days, vigil days, and sometimes just plain old Thursdays that happened to feel spiritually risky. If you were following the rules strictly, you were looking at maybe 1 or 2 guilt-free windows per month, and even then, only if you confessed beforehand, hadn't eaten anything sinful, and were both facing north. Historians still debate whether most people truly followed these restrictions or simply nodded along while doing as they pleased. For peasants who had bigger things to worry about, like not freezing to death, the rules were probably treated more like strong suggestions. But in wealthier households where chaplains and confessors hovered around like moral referees, the pressure to behave appropriately was immense. And even within marriage, things could feel regulated. There's a famous 13th century guidebook that offered advice for married couples trying to remain virtuous. It recommended approaching one another without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Which sounds less like romance and more like reading aloud the fine print on a bottle of medieval cold medicine. The favored position was the one considered most natural, what we now call missionary, not just for practical reasons, but because anything else might draw suspicion. Too much enthusiasm, too much affection, even too much eye contact could be frowned upon. The idea was to be fruitful, not flirty, and confession wasn't exactly vague on the details. Priests were trained to ask questions that today would get them politely escorted off most podcasts. They wanted to know when, how often, and whether it had been done with the proper reverence and without unnecessary joy. Have you sinned with your spouse was not a rhetorical question. They expected an answer, specifics and all. It's said that some priests knew more about the private lives of their parishioners than they did about their birthdays or last names. And if you thought skipping confession was an option, well, someone else might report you. Gossip in a medieval village traveled faster than a flea on a plague rat. It wasn't just about monitoring behavior, though. The theology behind all this was deeply rooted in the idea that the body was inherently flawed. Temptation was everywhere. Even inside marriage, the church viewed lust as dangerous. The goal was to elevate the soul by restraining the flesh. And the more you abstained, the holier you became. Celibacy wasn't just for monks. Married couples were often encouraged to take periodic vows of abstinence, especially during holy seasons or after childbirth. Some even did so, permanently becoming what the church called spiritual spouses, or what modern historians might gently label deeply tired. Of course, like all things medieval enforcement varied. Some priests ignored the rules entirely, some regions were more lenient than others, and many ordinary folks adopted a don't ask, don't confess policy. If the barn doors were closed and no one saw who's to say what really happened on that quiet Tuesday in April. But still the pressure was there. The idea that physical closeness, even with your own spouse, could be sinful if done on the wrong day or with too much gusto. Let's not forget the consequences. One bishop reportedly scolded a married couple for being excessively affectionate, which in their case meant more than once a month. He advised they direct their passions toward prayer. The couple, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled. Another couple was ordered to perform public penance for being intimate during Lent. Public, as in everyone watching, as in walk through the town square wearing a sign and a face full of shame kind of public. And no, they didn't get a discount on their tithe that year. The paradox is almost poetic. The church needed people to marry and have children to grow communities, fill pews and pay taxes, but also wanted those children conceived in a state of mild regret and profound self-restraint. It was a bit like encouraging people to bake bread while warning them that enjoying the smell of yeast was morally compromising. Here's a fun fact. You didn't ask for some medieval confession manuals included actual charts. Year charts of which days were forbidden. These looked like spiritual obstacle courses. Imagine flipping through a parchment calendar only to find red X's across half the month. Oh no, Tuesday is St. Mildred's feast, and also a quarter moon will have to wait until next fortnight. And yet despite the fear, guilt, and theological acrobatics, people still found time and space to connect. They bent rules, they whispered under blankets, they timed things between masses and market days. Because at the end of the day or night, human nature doesn't ask for permission, it just waits for the goat to fall asleep. So if you're wondering whether medieval people were more repressed than us, the answer is complicated. Yes, they had more rules. Yes, they were judged more harshly. Yes, they were encouraged to feel guilty about things we now celebrate with champagne and scented candles. But they also lived in a world that found meaning in every gesture, every ritual, every sigh. Even in bed, they believed what they did mattered not just to their spouse, but to heaven itself. Tonight, as you drift off, consider that. The idea that love wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. That the timing of your affection might align with the stars. That your desire might carry weight in a ledger only God could read. And maybe, just maybe, that Tuesdays in April were the most romantic nights of all. There's an old medieval saying, probably made up by a monk with a lot of opinions and not enough hugs, that married couples should approach each other without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Romantic, isn't it? Like being handed a love letter written by a tax accountant. But this wasn't just pious poetry. It reflected a larger, deeply structured belief system about what was acceptable between married people behind closed, or more accurately, curtainless doors. Because the church didn't just supervise when intimacy could happen, it had very clear opinions on how it should happen too. Let's begin delicately with positions. There weren't many to choose from, at least not if you wanted to keep your soul squeaky clean. The preferred method was what we now call missionary. Why? Because it was seen as the most natural, the least scandalous, and the position least likely to invite divine judgment. Anything else was suspect. Anything that felt like it might involve innovation, agility, or heaven forbid fun was best left unspoken and definitely unpracticed. Theologians debated whether alternative positions were sinful or merely misguided, but the general mood was skeptical. Try anything too enthusiastic and you might find yourself not only on the church's naughty list, but also answering some rather specific questions during your next confession. And yes, let's talk about that confession. If you think it's awkward to talk to your therapist about your love life, imagine sitting on a cold wooden bench in a stone church, explaining to a middle-aged friar why you felt a flicker of passion last Tuesday night. Medieval confession wasn't vague. Priests were trained to ask pointed, sometimes excruciatingly detailed questions. Had you been intimate on a holy day? Had you enjoyed it too much? Had you allowed your spouse to initiate? Had you used gestures? These weren't rhetorical questions. They were spiritual diagnostics. The goal wasn't to embarrass you, at least not entirely, but to help you cleanse your soul of any lingering joy that might have slipped in between the guilt. One particularly zealous guidebook for confessors even included a checklist of forbidden behaviors between spouses. These included everything from excessive touching to eye contact that lingered. Yes, eye contact. Apparently, locking gazes too long was a fast track to mortal sin. Who knew pupils were such dangerous portals? Historians still debate how strictly these confessional guidelines were enforced. In some rural parishes, the local priest might have been more concerned with sheep theft than romantic transgressions. But in urban centers, or among the nobility where spiritual advisors hovered like ecclesiastical life coaches, people often took the rules very seriously. Or at least they pretended to. Among the nobility, every aspect of married life could be scrutinized. Wealthy couples were expected to set a moral example, which meant temperance in all things, including affection. Husbands were advised to resist temptation even within marriage. Wives were encouraged to submit dutifully quietly, and preferably while thinking about something holier than their husband's beard. Any deviation from this script could result in social whispers, moral condemnation, or a strongly worded letter from the local bishop. Even medical texts got involved. Some physicians of the time warned that too much passion could cause illness. For men, it might weaken the spirit or drain vital humors. For women, it might wait for it cause uterine, wondering a deeply unscientific belief that the uterus could actually detach and float around the body if improperly stimulated. Which, to be fair, is a very creative way of saying, let's all calm down. Still, couples were human. They got creative, especially the ones who were more in love than in line with church doctrine. Secret affection blossomed in quiet places. Love notes were written in the margins of prayer books. A squeeze of the hand at the feast table. A lingering glance across the chapel. These tiny rebellions didn't go unnoticed, but they also weren't always punished. Some priests looked the other way. Some, perhaps remembering their own longings, chose to emphasize compassion over correction. And while confession often focused on what you shouldn't do, it also functioned as a kind of release valve. A place where people could speak about things they didn't dare admit anywhere else. That doesn't mean it was comfortable. It just means that for some, it was the only space where these tensions between desire and duty, between love and law, could be named out loud. Of course, not everyone agreed with the church's teachings. Folk traditions persisted alongside theology. In some villages, elders passed down advice that was far more lenient, sometimes even celebratory. Love songs told of couples meeting under the moonlight, of kisses stolen in the hayloft of passion that was as holy in its honesty as any hymn. These songs didn't make it into official doctrine, but they echoed through marketplaces and meadows, reminding everyone that there was another way to think about love. One that wasn't quite so grayscale. Even the church occasionally contradicted itself. Some saints wrote tenderly about divine love in ways that bordered on romantic. Some sermons described the soul's longing for God using imagery that would make a troubadour blush. The lines blurred. Were these metaphors or something more? Historians still debated. But the language so full of yearning suggests that even in the most spiritual hearts, desire had a place. In one recorded case, a couple asked to take a vow of celibacy after years of marriage. They claimed it brought them closer to God. The local priest granted the request, but then became concerned when their neighbors started doing the same, possibly one suspect out of jealousy or confusion. Soon, an entire hamlet was declaring spiritual partnerships, and not a single child had been born that year. The bishop had to intervene. He suggested they at least stagger their abstinence for demographic stability. Romance meet spreadsheet. And if you're wondering what happened to couples who simply enjoyed each other quietly, modestly, without confessing every detail, the answer is most of them were fine. Because beneath all the rules and rituals, the medieval world was still made of people. People who found ways to connect to love and to build lives together. Even if the church told them to keep the candles unlit and the smiles to a minimum. So tonight, as you pull your covers a little higher, consider this: in a world that feared passion, some still found joy. In a culture that warned against too much touching hands, still reached across blankets. And in a time when love came with a handbook of prohibitions, people still fell for each other softly, secretly, and sometimes sinfully. The bed may have been straw, the windows drafty, the priest suspicious, but love found a way, even if it had to whisper. By now, you've probably figured out that love in the Middle Ages wasn't so much about sweeping gestures or candlelit ballads as it was about surviving the rules. But before two people even reached the haystack, assuming they weren't already sleeping in the same bed with 6 relatives and a goat, they had to get through one of the most practical, calculated, and emotionally void processes known to the medieval world courtship. In theory, marriage is a celebration of love, right? Not here. In medieval Europe, marriage was a business deal, a land contract, and occasionally a ceasefire between two angry families who couldn't agree on who stole whose cabbage last spring. For most people, especially peasants and tradesfolk, choosing a spouse wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about finding someone who wouldn't start fights at the village well and could churn butter without causing drama. Let's start with the basics. If you were a peasant, your family likely arranged your marriage with another local family. They would assess the other party's assets, land, livestock, reputation, the condition of the family's roof, and whether the future spouse had strong arms or a dowry that included something useful like a goose or 3 decent wooden spoons. Love was not part of this conversation. Love, if it came at all, was a pleasant side effect. Like finding out your arranged spouse also happened to smell vaguely of lavender instead of fish. If you were a noble, things got even more political. Marriages among the upper classes were strategic chess moves used to gain property, secure alliances, or avoid war. A daughter might be promised at age 6, her marriage sealed before she had all her teeth. And the groom, he might be 10 years her senior or a complete stranger. The important thing was whether his family had the right crest, not whether he had a winning smile. Kings married queens, not for affection, but for borders. A princess of France might be shipped off to Scotland with a chest of linen and the vague hope that her husband wouldn't die of dysentery before producing an heir. Her feelings on the matter entirely irrelevant. There are recorded instances where a young woman cried at her wedding only to be told that joy was not part of the expectation. She was there to unite families and secure peace, not to dance in the meadows. And what about the ceremony itself? Surprisingly, the church didn't require much pageantry. In fact, until the 12th century, many marriages were sealed by simple verbal agreements. If both parties said, "I do," even in a field, it counted. No priest, no witnesses, just mutual consent, and possibly a nearby cow. That said, weddings could be festive events, especially in rural communities. After all, any excuse to drink heavily and roast something over a fire was welcome. But even then, the focus was on the legal and communal aspects. Who gets which patch of land? What happens if someone dies early? Is the dowry paid in coin or chickens? And of course, was there proof the couple had actually slept together? Because consummation wasn't just a private matter, it was a legal requirement. In some cases, witnesses were expected to verify it. Not visually, thankfully, but by seeing the couple enter the bedchamber and remain there long enough to complete the act. Subtlety was not a strong suit of the time. Now let's talk about how people met, because while arranged marriages were the norm, some individuals did have a say in their futures. Particularly among peasants or townsfolk where parental control might be firm, but not absolute, young people found ways to interact. Village festivals, market days, church services all provided opportunities to spot a potential spouse and maybe, just maybe, share a shy smile or pass a secret token. A flower, a baked good, a piece of ribbon, small gestures that said, "I see you, and I don't think your boots smell too bad." But romance was not a solo sport. Young couples were rarely left alone. A maiden might be chaperoned not only by her mother, but by an entire extended family, a gaggle of nosy neighbors, and if things looked too cozy, a passing friar with a suspicious look. Some young women were even guarded during social events. Dances, for example, came with strict rules: no touching, no whispering. And if your hands lingered too long during a twirl, someone would clear their throat loudly until you looked away in shame. If the couple managed to sneak away, which sometimes meant walking 3 steps behind a group of gossips instead of within arm's reach, they might have a brief moment of privacy. But even then, affection had to be subtle. A hand clasped too tightly. A glance held too long. Because if word got out that a maiden had been too friendly, it could tarnish her reputation and damage her family's chances of securing a good match. And let's not forget the economic side. Dowries were a big deal. A bride might bring coins, linen, a milk cow, or even a modest plot of farmland to the marriage. In return, the groom's family promised to treat her well and not be entirely awful. That was the bar, not entirely awful. Real love might come later. Or not. And that was fine. After all, the primary goal was survival, not butterflies. Among nobles, marriages were arranged with military precision. Letters were exchanged, priests consulted, land surveys conducted. Occasionally the bride and groom didn't meet until the wedding day. There are accounts of grooms asking their advisors quietly, "Is she at least presentable?" And of brides whispering to their maids, "Tell me again what country I just married into." One popular proverb of the time went something like, "Better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples." It's not exactly Shakespeare, but it tells you everything about the priorities of the age. A pleasant personality was a bonus, a good inheritance essential. Still, affection wasn't impossible. Some couples grew to like each other, even love each other. They worked side by side in fields or managed households together. They raised children, fought through bad harvests, shared soup in the winter, and learned each other's rhythms. Love in the medieval world was more often built than discovered. It didn't start with sonnets. It started with doing the chores without complaining too much. Let's pause for an odd fact. In some areas, marriage could be established simply by living together and referring to each other as husband and wife. No church ceremony, no paperwork. Just mutual acknowledgement and a village that agreed to look the other way. This practice, known as common law marriage, caused so much confusion that the church eventually cracked down on it. But for a time, it meant that love could sneak in under the radar, quiet, unofficial, but just as real. So tonight, as you settle into your quiet, unsupervised bed, think about those medieval couples, the ones who married for cows but stayed for kindness, who found comfort in shared silence, partnership, and shared work. They didn't have dating apps or candlelit dinners, but they had patience, and sometimes over time they had love. Not dramatic, not poetic, but steady. And in the end, maybe that's what made it last. If falling in love in medieval times was difficult, staying in love under surveillance was practically an Olympic sport. Because in the rare event that you did feel something fluttery in your chest, something resembling what bards sang about, and poets awkwardly rhymed with maiden, you'd better hope that feeling came with a hefty dose of caution. Because nothing in this world shut down young love faster than the collective weight of your family, your village, your priest, and your local livestock, all watching you like unpaid security guards. Let's begin with the concept of supervised affection. Picture a young maiden standing near the well, shyly glancing at a local cooper's apprentice who's just a little too good at making barrels. He gives her a smile, small and careful, and she smiles back. Immediately, 3 aunts materialize from behind the ox cart. One clears her throat, another asks loudly if anyone needs water. The third just stares. You'd think she was summoning demons, not making eye contact. For noble families, the restrictions were even more absurd. Daughters of the gentry weren't just chaperoned. They were guarded, literally. Some noble girls were raised in almost total seclusion, educated in piety, embroidery, and walking slowly with grace, all while being watched like royal treasure. Their interactions with men were limited to arranged audiences, formal feasts, and the occasional forced walk in the garden while someone's aunt hovered 5 paces behind. There are even documented cases where love letters were intercepted, read aloud to family councils, and then used as evidence in whether a match was still honorable. Of course, all this watching didn't stop romance. It just made it more creative. Secret trysts were scheduled with the same care as the diplomatic meetings. A glance during vespers, a touch while handing off a basket of apples. Lovers invented codes, dropped hints through embroidery patterns, or sang songs with lyrics just obscure enough to avoid trouble. Historians still debate whether certain folk songs were harmless jigs or elaborate marriage proposals hidden in rhyme and metaphor. Young men, for their part, also faced scrutiny, though somewhat less intense. A farm boy seen talking too long to a girl might be warned by her father, her brother, or the town reeve himself. But unless the girl had a dowry, a known virtue, or an uncle in the clergy, the consequences for him were more social than spiritual. He might be scolded or challenged to a poorly coordinated duel, but rarely would his future hang in the balance. And yet, despite the risks, affection blossomed in small, stolen moments. Midnight strolls, whispered confessions under the rafters of a barn, shared chores that just happened to involve lingering by the butter churn. You couldn't hold hands in public, but you could pass each other bread with a meaningful pause. You couldn't kiss at church, but you could sing to each other during festivals, if your lyrics were vague enough. There's a reason that so many medieval love stories involve letters, poetry, and song. It wasn't just that people were romantic, it was that they were desperate for ways to communicate without getting caught. Bards became the secret voice of every silenced courtship. Their verses, supposedly fictional, were often deeply personal. A noble lady might request a song about a brave knight who'd never heard of her father's land, but somehow everyone in the hall knew exactly whom the verses described. And what if you were caught? What if someone saw you walking too close, or worse, kissing behind the granary? Well, then came the consequences. Public penance. A fine. A scolding from the priest delivered with the kind of eye contact that made your knees go weak, not from romance but from shame. In some towns, the punishment included wearing a special garment that marked you as morally suspect. In others, you might have to kneel in front of the church and apologize. Loudly, while chickens watched, judgmentally. Let's take a moment to appreciate how layered the medieval gossip machine was. Small communities meant that every look, every conversation, every vague change in mood could become the subject of speculation. If a girl smiled too often at market, rumors might start. If a boy stopped visiting the smithy and began frequenting the baker's stall, people noticed. And if two people were seen together on a feast day, well, that was practically a marriage proposal. Still, couples adapted. They found allies, sympathetic siblings, indulgent aunts, the occasional bored monk who had seen too much and cared too little. One odd case from a town in France tells of a young couple who enlisted the help of a local blind beggar to deliver love notes. He pretended to beg at doorways, then quietly handed off scraps of parchment. Was it risky? Absolutely. Was it brilliant? Definitely. Among the peasantry, the rules were somewhat looser. Yes, reputations mattered. A girl known for being too familiar with village boys might struggle to find a respectable match, but families were often more pragmatic than punitive. If a couple clearly cared for each other and if a pregnancy occurred, marriage followed quickly. Sometimes with the blessing of the church, sometimes with a slightly awkward exchange of livestock and a muttered, "Well, it's done now." And this is where the concept of handfasting comes in. A sort of informal engagement, handfasting allowed a couple to declare themselves committed to one another, often with a simple ceremony or exchange of vows. In some regions, it was considered legally binding, at least until a formal church wedding could be arranged. It gave couples a little breathing room, a small social loophole where love and propriety could coexist. Naturally, the church eventually tried to stamp it out. Too many couples using it as an excuse to get cozy without a priest nearby. Let's not forget the role of seasonal festivals in young love. May Day, harvest feasts, midwinter dances. These were golden opportunities for flirting under the guise of celebration. Dancing games, shared tasks in the field. The whole village relaxed, and for once the watchful eyes turned elsewhere. These were the moments when someone might offer a flower, a song, or a quiet promise that they'd wait, no matter how long it took for the parents to come around. Of course, not every flirtation turned into marriage. Some ended in heartbreak, some ended in scandal, some ended with one party disappearing mysteriously to live with relatives in another town, but many turned into slow, sturdy love. Love that began with glances, survived scrutiny, and endured the endless waiting. Love that grew not in secret gardens, but in shared work-whispered jokes and the quiet act of walking home together while the moon rose behind the trees. So tonight, as your thoughts drift into dreams, picture a pair of lovers on a dusty path walking 5 steps apart while pretending not to smile. Picture the way their fingers almost touch when they pass each other a basket of apples. Picture the pause before parting, the way they say goodbye with their eyes because words are too risky. In a world that demanded silence, sometimes a glance said everything. If you've made it this far into medieval romance, you might be wondering about one of the most persistent, awkward, and metallic legends ever whispered through history, the chastity belt. Ah yes, the infamous iron underpants. The ultimate anti-flirtation device. The padlocked panties of legend. You've seen them in cartoons. You've heard about them in salacious medieval reenactments. But tonight we're going to gently remove the myth carefully because it's rusted and talk about what actually went on down there. Spoiler alert, it probably didn't involve locks, keys, or a visit to the local blacksmith. Let's set the scene. Your husband is a knight heading off to the Crusades. He fears temptation, not his own, of course yours, because clearly without his presence, you might fall into the arms of every bard butcher or sheep herder who looked your way. So what's a paranoid knight to do? Easy. Strap you into a device made of iron leather spikes and a bad design and lock it until he returns years later. Except that's almost entirely nonsense. Despite the vivid imagery, there's no solid evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the examples you see today, the ones in museums, books, or unfortunate Halloween costumes, come from the Renaissance, or even the Victorian era. A time when people were obsessed with the idea of medieval repression, even if they didn't quite get the history right. Historians still debate the origins of the myth, but most agree it was probably a combination of satire, fear-mongering, and misunderstanding. Some of the earliest known belts were actually part of medical treatments designed to prevent self-harm or masturbation, not to protect a woman's virtue while her husband went sword shopping in Jerusalem. And let's be honest for a second. The design of these things, wildly impractical. Imagine trying to wear a hunk of metal around your hips every day in a time when even basic hygiene was ambitious. You're already washing once a month on a good month, and now there's rust involved, infection, discomfort, and the very real possibility that you'd need a locksmith just to go to the bathroom. It wasn't just ineffective, it was dangerous. So where did the legend come from? Likely from a mix of Renaissance moral panic, Victorian prudishness, and a few satirical illustrations that were never meant to be taken literally. The 16th century German engraver Albrecht Dürer, for example, created fantastical images of belts with terrifying spikes and dramatic keys, but they were jokes. Commentary on male insecurity. Visual metaphors for controlling women's desires. The medieval version of a meme. But satire, like gossip, travels fast, and by the 1800s the chastity belt had taken on a life of its own. Museum curators, eager to shock and titillate, displayed dubious artifacts labeled authentic medieval devices. Never mind that many of these items had no documented origin, no wear marks, and were made of materials that didn't even exist in the supposed time period. It made a good story. And people love a good story. In reality, medieval societies enforced fidelity through more traditional mean surveillance, shame, and good old-fashioned religious fear. Noble women were chaperoned within an inch of their lives. They had maids, tutors, and nuns assigned not just to educate them, but to watch them. Peasant girls didn't have attendants, but they had something better or worse depending on your point of view. An entire village with nothing better to do than monitor everyone else's behavior. You see, reputation was everything. A woman's perceived chastity wasn't just a matter of morality, it was currency. A valuable, fragile asset that determined her marriage prospects, her family's status, and sometimes even her legal standing. Gossip could ruin someone faster than the plague. And in a world with no social media, no fingerprints, and no photography, your good name was the only ID you had. Did you know that in some regions towns kept official moral rolls, public lists of who had committed what sins, not just big crimes? We're talking about people accused of flirting, touching, even winking suggestively. If your name appeared on the list, it stuck. And while some townsmen might find a roguish reputation, charming women rarely got the same benefit of the doubt. So if chastity belts weren't real, why do they still loom so large in our imagination? Maybe because they tap into something timeless, the tension between desire and control. They represent in one clunky metal object the fear that someone somewhere might be enjoying something you think they shouldn't. And that fear of freedom, of pleasure, of autonomy has echoed through history in far more subtle and far more dangerous ways than an iron belt ever could. There's also something undeniably theatrical about the chastity belt. It's a prop, a visual punchline, easy to understand, easier to sensationalize. It shows up in films, jokes, even advertisements, and because it's just believable enough, it endures, even when it doesn't make any sense, even when it never really happened. But the reality of medieval control was far more intimate and insidious. It wasn't about hardware, it was about expectations. A woman's body was policed by eyes, by words, by assumptions, by the stories told about her when she passed the market stall or skipped morning mass, by the men who claimed to know her and the women who pretended not to. Control came not with locks but with looks. And yes, there were exceptions. Women who defied the system, who took lovers' forged paths and scandalized their neighbors. But they paid a price. They were labeled punished, exiled, or married off to someone far away. Their choices, however brave, became cautionary tales for the next generation. Stories mothers whispered to daughters as warnings. So tonight, as you lay in your soft bed free of buckles and suspicious clasps, take a moment to appreciate the comfort of freedom. The freedom to love, to choose, to be alone or not. No chaperones, no public ledgers, no moral rolls posted on the church door. And as for the chastity belt, let it rest as what it truly is. Not a medieval artifact, but a relic of our collective imagination. A myth built of rust and worry, still clanking its way through bedtime stories. But not yours, not tonight. If the church hoped to control passion with sermons and sin charts, and if chastity belts turned out to be more myth than metal, then who really had the final say on how and where intimacy flourished in the medieval world? That honor, oddly enough, may belong to city councils, tax collectors, and brothel keepers, because in many parts of medieval Europe, brothels weren't just tolerated, they were legally regulated, and in a few cases, municipally approved. That's right, the very institutions that banned dancing on holy days were quietly charging taxes on sex work behind the town square. Let's walk through a typical medieval city. Cobblestone streets winding under stone arches, a market full of shouting vendors, the smell of fish firewood and damp wool hanging in the air. In the shadow of the cathedral stands a tall, timber-framed building with a crimson sign. No neon, of course, but maybe a subtle red kerchief or carved symbol over the door. Inside it's not all velvet and mystery. It's loud, practical, and filled with very tired women trying to negotiate economics, personal safety, and the whims of clients who pay in coins, eggs, or badly spun poetry. This wasn't a medieval secret. In towns like Paris, London, and Bruges, brothels operated in designated districts, often near rivers, ports, or market roads, places where traffic was high and morals were flexible. Some cities even had special ordinances spelling out the rights and duties of sex workers. They could work during certain hours. They had to pass basic health inspections. They were expected to wear specific clothing to mark their profession. And yes, they paid taxes, because in the grand tradition of bureaucracy, sin that could be counted could also be taxed. The logic was cynical but straightforward. If men had no legal outlet for desire, they might pursue more dangerous paths, adultery, assault, or heaven forbid, marrying for love. Brothels were seen as a pressure valve, a necessary evil that kept society functional. Much like chamber pots and feudalism, they weren't ideal, but they got the job done. Of course, the church officially condemned the entire business. Many bishops thundered from pulpits about impurity and damnation. But unofficially, things got murkier. Some clergy turned a blind eye. Others rented property to brothels or quietly collected rent. There are even records of monasteries receiving a portion of the profits from nearby establishments. Historians still debate whether this was out of hypocrisy, pragmatism, or a deeply flawed understanding of property management. In some towns, the brothel was run by a city official known as the Keeper of Public Women, a job title that probably didn't fit neatly on a resume. His responsibilities included maintaining order, handling disputes, and ensuring the rules were followed. There were even guidebooks, actual administrative handbooks on how to manage a successful brothel. These included rules about sheet changing weekly at minimum allowable services, no blasphemy or animal noises, and closing hours usually before the morning bell. The women who worked in these establishments came from many walks of life. Some were there by choice widows, orphans, or women with no family support who saw sex work as more stable than domestic service. Others were coerced, tricked, or trafficked, especially in port cities where sailors arrived with coin and complications. Conditions varied wildly. Some brothels offered relative safety, communal support, and decent food. Others were harsh, exploitative, and deeply dangerous. Oddly enough, social class played a role even here. Brothels weren't all equal. There were upscale ones that catered to knights, merchants, and the occasional poet with delusions of grandeur. These places had music, food, and decor that tried its best to say elegance despite being soaked in candle wax and regret. Then there were the rougher establishments, the alley dens, tavern rooms, and barely covered corners of bathhouses where the risks were higher and the prices lower. Clients came from every tier of society. Apprentices, bakers, students, noblemen, and yes, even monks. Despite vows of chastity, historical records show that many members of the clergy frequented brothels. Some even had regular favorites and kept ledgers of their visits. A few got caught. Fewer were punished, and some, perhaps, the ones with the best Latin, managed to argue their way out of trouble by declaring their intentions were purely pastoral. Payment didn't always come in coins. Some patrons paid in barter eggs, cloth, firewood, or labor. One documented case tells of a man who traded a live goose for an hour of companionship. The woman in question reportedly accepted the goose but charged him extra when it escaped into the pantry. Let's talk briefly about how the town saw these women. They were both visible and invisible, officially marked, often watched, and subject to scrutiny, but also essential. Their presence was a given, their services quietly respected, and their struggles largely ignored. Some were mocked, some were pitied, some were quietly admired. A few even rose in influence madams who owned property, lent money, and navigated city politics better than some aldermen. There's a record from a southern German town of a woman known as Matilda the Red. She ran a well-kept establishment, employed a dozen women, and was known for always paying her taxes early. When the town tried to shut her down for moral reasons, she calmly presented the accounting books showing how much revenue her business brought in. The council, after a long pause, decided to let her continue. One might say virtue bowed to arithmetic. But life in the profession was hard. Disease, violence, and social scorn were constant threats. Legal protections existed on paper but were rarely enforced. Many women died young. Others vanished from records, names erased by time or shame. And while some found ways to leave the trade through marriage patronage or religious conversion, many simply faded their stories untold. Still, they were part of the medieval city's fabric, as present as the baker, the priest, or the gravedigger. And their presence tells us something important, that even in an age ruled by piety and punishment, human need made space for compromise. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, Remember the quiet corners of old cities, the lamplit streets, the creaking floorboards, the whispered laughter behind half-open shutters. Remember the women who lit candles, counted coins, and carved out slivers of agency in a world built to deny them. Their names may be lost, but their stories remain scrawled in margins sung in taverns, and sometimes, just sometimes, tucked gently between the lines of history. The flickering candlelight reveals not rose petals or perfume, but layers of wool, the scent of wet leather, and something far less romantic wafting up from the chamber pot. Welcome to the sensual atmosphere of medieval hygiene. If you've ever worried about bad breath on a first date or debated showering before a Netflix binge, be grateful you weren't courting in 13th century Europe. Because back then, romance came wrapped in the unmistakable musk of survival. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval people did care about cleanliness, just not as often or in the ways we'd recognize. Bathing happened, but it wasn't a daily ritual. For peasants, it was more of a seasonal event or a surprise like falling in a river. On average, a working-class villager might bathe once a month, more if they were lucky enough to live near a clean stream, less if they had to compete with geese for access to a pond. Soap was available but rare. It was either imported and expensive or made at home from lard and ash, a combination that got the job done but left you smelling faintly of burned bacon. Hair washing involved rainwater eggs or sometimes fermented herbs. Teeth were scrubbed with ash, rubbed with cloth, or left to fend for themselves. If you were particularly refined, you might chew on mint leaves or fennel seeds, but floss, never heard of her. Now picture a medieval couple meeting for a romantic evening. The woman arrives in her best linen gown, undyed stiff from repeated washing in lye and layered beneath two other wool garments that haven't seen fresh air since last harvest. The man shows up, straight from the fields, face smudged with soot and soil, boots squelching with something unidentifiable. They sit beside a hearth surrounded by the scent of drying meat, open fire, and people who have been wearing the same clothes for 3 weeks. It was intimate, just not in the way we think. Clothing was layered and heavy. Even in summer, people wore wool, linen, and occasionally fur. This wasn't a fashion statement, it was necessity. But those layers trapped everything: sweat, smoke, spilled ale, and the ghost of every chore you'd done that week. And since outer garments were rarely washed, too expensive, too delicate, the smells lingered. Not to mention your feet. Shoes were made of leather, often worn without socks, and waterproofing was more of a dream than a reality. The result, let's just say, socks weren't the only thing lost in history. They were probably burned for mercy. So how did people flirt carefully? Smells aside, there were still expectations. A young man might present a token of affection, a flower, a charm, a meat pie. If he had access to a bathhouse, he might scrub up first. But if not, he'd splash water on his face, rub his armpits with herbs, and hope for the best. Perfume. That was for nobles. They used rosewater, lavender oil, or musky concoctions, imported at great expense. Peasants had to settle for dried rosemary or the faint smell of fresh hay. Public bathhouses did exist in towns and cities. They were social spaces where men and women bathed, sometimes separately, sometimes together, depending on the place and the level of supervision. The bath experience was structured: warm up in a steamy room, scrub with cloths, maybe enjoy a quick massage, and rinse off with clean water. For the wealthy, it was a full-body ritual with servants assisting. For everyone else, it was a rare luxury, squeezed in between work, holy days, and outbreaks of plague. Speaking of plague, public baths sometimes got a bad reputation. During disease outbreaks, they were closed or condemned as people feared that hot water and shared tubs might spread illness. Some even believed that bathing too often weakened the body's defenses by opening the pores to bad air. Others worried that washing away too much grime might also wash away spiritual protection. Result: cleanliness became suspicious, especially if you did it too enthusiastically. Some medieval people believed that women who bathed too often were more prone to sin. Clean skin, they thought, invited vanity lust or even flirtation. So in some areas, women were discouraged from bathing more than absolutely necessary, unless they were preparing for marriage, childbirth, or confession. A spiritual olfactory and social reset all at once. Despite the funk, people still kissed, they still snuggled, they still found each other attractive. Romance adjusted to the conditions, and in a strange way it became more democratic. If everyone smelled earthy, no one was singled out. Love was blind and a little nose blind. There were attempts at freshening up. Potpourri sachets were tucked into clothes, herbal waters were dabbed on wrists. Chewing cloves or cardamom helped with breath. A few brave souls even tried medieval deodorant, alum blocks, vinegar rinses, or pastes made from chalk and dried flowers. The results were mixed, some sweet, some sour, all temporary. And what about the most intimate moments? Well, expectations were different. If you grew up surrounded by shared beds, farm animals, and fire pits, your tolerance for strong smells and rough textures was much higher. A bit of dirt under the nails, normal. A waft of garlic comforting. A musky tunic worn through a week of hay threshing, practically cologne. Still, there's evidence that couples tried. Medieval love poems mention soft touches, braided hair, and sweet breath. There are recipes for love potions made from rose petals and honey, suggesting that even amid the muck, people yearned for beauty. Some households kept small basins for sponge baths. Others heated water over fires for quick rinses before bed. Romance even then involved effort. One humorous account describes a newlywed couple so eager to impress each other that they both tried to secretly bathe before meeting. They ended up using the same bucket, reheating the water twice and emerging smelling faintly of onions and pine. It didn't go well, but it did go lovingly. So tonight, as you stretch out in your clean sheets, freshly showered, possibly wearing something soft and fragrant, take a moment to appreciate modern hygiene. The warm water, the soaps, the silence. And remember, medieval couples didn't fall in love despite the smells, they fell in love through them. They found beauty in closeness, in shared labor, in the stubborn joy of affection that didn't need lavender to be sincere. Even if the room smelled like turnips and wet wool. Imagine you're standing in a smoky kitchen, herbs hanging from the rafters, a faint waft of something sharp and earthy drifting from the hearth. A midwife leans over a pot, stirring a concoction of wine wildflower and something suspiciously labeled ground beaver. She turns to you with a straight face and says, "Drink this. It'll keep the babies away." And just like that, you've entered the wildly creative and occasionally terrifying world of medieval birth control. Let's be clear, right up front, medieval people absolutely understood the link between sex and pregnancy. Despite the church's best efforts to frame reproduction as a divine mystery, most folks were painfully aware that certain actions led to more mouths to feed. And while contraception wasn't effective by modern standards, that didn't stop anyone from trying. People across Europe passed down remedies, rituals, and whispered advice blending folk medicine, herbalism, and sheer hopeful desperation. The motivations were often practical. A peasant family with limited resources could only support so many children. An unmarried woman facing pregnancy risked scandal, punishment, and exile. And for many, avoiding conception wasn't just about pleasure. It was survival. So what did they use? Let's start with herbal concoctions. Some of the most commonly used plants included pennyroyal Queen Anne's lace rue and wild carrot seeds. These were taken as teas mixed with wine or chewed raw. Some were believed to prevent conception, others to end an early pregnancy. Effectiveness, let's say, mixed. Some herbs might have had genuine hormonal effects. Others just gave people headaches and upset stomachs. And yet they persisted, passed from midwives to daughters to herbalists, quietly ignored by priests who didn't want to know. Then came the more theatrical options. One popular method advised drinking wine boiled with crushed beaver testicles. Another suggested wearing amulets carved with specific runes, preferably blessed by someone literate and ideally sober. A few guides proposed burying animal bones under the doorstep to divert fertility spirits. There were even rituals involving walking backwards while holding a candle and muttering verses. Historians still debate whether these were symbolic acts of faith or early examples of fertility-themed improv theater. Barrier methods in the loosest sense also existed. Some women used linen cloths soaked in vinegar or honey and inserted them before intercourse. Others tried beeswax plugs or sea sponges soaked in herbal mixtures. These were uncomfortable, unreliable, and often more symbolic than practical. But they reflected a basic recurring theme, people trying anything, to take a little control over their reproductive lives. In parts of medieval Spain, women were advised to hold their breath and jump up and down vigorously after sex. This wasn't just to avoid conception. It was, according to one source, to shake loose the seed. Whether or not it worked, it probably built calf muscles and inspired many confused chickens. Naturally, the church had a lot to say about all of this, and most of it was no. Any attempt to avoid conception, especially within marriage, was seen as sinful. Procreation was considered the sole holy purpose of sex. Pleasure planning and personal choice were frowned upon. Some church authorities condemned even the idea of preventing pregnancy, calling it a rebellion against divine will. But as with many things, the official stance and daily practice didn't always align. Among married couples, especially those facing poverty, illness, or exhaustion, there was a quiet, pragmatic effort to space out children. They might abstain during certain times of the month, avoid intimacy during known fertile periods, even if their calendar was mostly guesswork, or lean on the whispered advice of midwives who'd seen things. These midwives were crucial. They were the keepers of knowledge, the ones who understood herb cycles and symptoms. In many communities, they were both feared and revered. Too much knowledge could look like witchcraft, but too little, and the whole village suffered. And yes, there were attempts at male contraception too, though far fewer. Some men wore protective charms or tied leather bands around their thighs. There are scattered references to sheep intestine sheaths, early versions of what would much later evolve into condoms. These were often reused, rarely comfortable, and almost never discussed in polite company. And since they weren't widely available or affordable, they remained the stuff of urban legend and experimental evenings. Still, none of it was foolproof. It was. Birth control, such as it was, depended on word-of-mouth, regional customs, and a whole lot of faith. When it failed, and it often did, the consequences were swift. Unwed mothers faced fines, shame, or forced marriages. Noble women could lose inheritance claims. Peasant girls might be sent to distant relatives to help with the harvest, never to return the same. And yet, life went on. People loved, stumbled, and hoped. They made mistakes and tried to avoid repeating them. They traded tips and whispers, gathered herbs in moonlight, and quietly resisted a system that demanded they bear children endlessly, regardless of cost or choice. There is a recorded case of a woman in 14th century Italy who, after her 12th child, publicly asked the priest if it was permitted to rest her womb. The priest, flustered, advised more prayer. The woman, unimpressed, sought out the local midwife and reportedly lived out her days with no further surprises. There's something deeply human in these stories, not just in the potions and superstitions, but in the sheer resourcefulness. The desire for agency even in the smallest ways. In a world where fate ruled and God loomed large, trying to plan your own family, even with garlic goatskin and a prayer, was an act of quiet rebellion. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, think of those quiet rebels. The women who boiled herbs over smoky fires, the men who wore itchy charms under their tunics, the lovers who counted days on their fingers, hoping for a little grace. They didn't have options that worked, but they had determination. And sometimes that was enough to change a life, or at least delay it by 9 months. Now, despite all the caution, the herbs and the whispered rituals involving beaver parts, not everyone in medieval Europe waited for the church bells to ring before getting cozy. In fact, if you scratch the surface of parish records, or really just talk to anyone in a small village, with too much time and not enough boundaries, you'll find that premarital intimacy was far more common than the official story suggests. Let's call it what it was, people testing the goods. And while that may sound crass to modern ears in many rural communities, it was an unspoken part of courtship, not because people were libertines or rule breakers, but because life was practical. If you were about to bind your future to someone, land, labor, livestock, and all, it made sense to make sure the match worked emotionally and physically, even if no one talked about it openly. But medieval society did talk about it, loudly, judgmentally, and often in the form of fines. Across towns and parishes, local authorities kept what were known as moral rolls, essentially ledgers of who had misbehaved and when. These weren't private records tucked in a drawer. They were public, official, and highly specific. If you were caught or even suspected of having premarital sex, your name went in the book, often next to the words fornicated ahead of contract, or less poetically, got ahead of themselves. Punishments varied. In some towns you'd pay a fine. In others, you might be required to do public penance, such as kneeling at the church door on Sunday morning wearing your least flattering tunic. Occasionally, the community made you pay both the fine and bring a chicken. One wonders whether the chicken was symbolic, or just dinner. In certain German villages, there was a specific fine for fooling around in the hayloft. Not inside a house, not in the woods, just the hayloft. Apparently it happened so often they had to write it into policy. Efficient? Yes. Embarrassing? Also yes. Still, enforcement wasn't uniform. Some towns were lenient, especially if the couple eventually married. In fact, many communities had a legal workaround if two people got married after being caught. Their previous sin could be erased retroactively, blessed by matrimony. Like saying, we know we broke the rules, but look, we made it official. Can we go now? Some churches even offered discounts on the fine if the wedding followed quickly. Early bird penance, you might say. In cases where marriage didn't happen, the penalties were sharper. For women especially, the consequences could be severe. A visible pregnancy before marriage was social dynamite. A girl could lose her reputation, her marriage prospects, and her place in the community. Some were sent away to relatives to recover. Others were forced into marriages that were less about love and more about damage control. Men, as you might guess, faced fewer consequences. Unless the woman's family had power or the church was feeling particularly righteous that week, a man might walk away with a fine or a stern warning. Occasionally, if he refused to marry the woman he'd gotten pregnant, he might be pressured by both families, and if necessary, the entire village, to do the right thing, which was medieval shorthand for say your vows before someone brings out the pitchfork. Despite all this, there was a practice that blurred the lines between sin and ceremony handfasting. It was a kind of unofficial engagement, a spoken promise often made in front of witnesses or in the eyes of God alone. A couple would declare their intent to marry sometimes with symbolic gestures like clasped hands, shared bread, or whispered vows. In many places this was considered binding, not quite a marriage, but close enough that cohabitation and intimacy were tolerated, at least until the church caught on and decided that such DIY nuptials were a bit too popular for comfort. Historians still debate how widespread handfasting truly was, and whether the church's later condemnation stemmed from theology or sheer frustration at being left out of the loop. But while it lasted, it gave couples a path toward connection that didn't require dowries, contracts, or elaborate ceremonies, just honesty, intention, and perhaps a shared loaf of bread. Let's not forget, people weren't dumb. They knew the risks. They knew that pregnancy outside of marriage came with social, economic, and spiritual baggage, but they also lived in a world full of uncertainty, plague, famine, war, accidents involving cows. Sometimes love was seized in the moment. Sometimes affection bloomed too quickly. Sometimes desire simply overrode the fear. And when it did, the community responded not always with punishment, but often with pragmatism. If the couple clearly cared for each other, marriage followed. Sometimes with a little parental nudging, sometimes with the enthusiastic support of two entire families who just wanted to get it over with and move on to arguing about goats. Among the nobility, the stakes were far higher. A premarital scandal could derail years of alliance building. If a noblewoman was discovered to be compromised, the marriage deal might fall through. The dowry might be lost. The family's honor, and more importantly, its land claims, might be called into question. In these cases, the response was swift. The girl might be cloistered in a convent, married off to someone much older and preferably far away, or hidden until a solution was arranged. Occasionally, noble families forged false marriage contracts to prove the couple had always intended to wed, thus preserving the legitimacy of any children born. It's worth noting that not all premarital pregnancies were accidental. In some communities, a pregnancy was used as proof of fertility. If a woman could bear a child, she was more likely to be seen as a valuable wife. The practice wasn't universally accepted, but in places where inheritance depended on heirs, proving the bride before the wedding was a risk some families were willing to take. Of course, none of this made it easier for the women involved. Whether the result was marriage exile or punishment, the burden almost always fell on them. And yet, many found ways to navigate the system. They made pacts, negotiated with priests, or simply relied on a network of female relatives who'd been through it all before. So tonight, as you lie in your quiet room, think of those tangled, hushed love stories, the ones that began in haylofts, back kitchens, and fields under the moon. The couples who whispered vows before anyone gave them permission. The parents who sighed and arranged a wedding feast 2 months ahead of schedule. The priests who raised eyebrows but lowered fines. Love may not have always waited for a wedding, but in the end, life had a way of catching up and sometimes quietly blessing what began in the shadows. It might surprise you, but then again, maybe it won't, that the Middle Ages were far from the strictly heteronormative world they're often painted to be. Behind the solemn sermons, stone cloisters, and scrolls of canon law, love and attraction were quietly, stubbornly doing their own thing. Same-sex desire not only existed in medieval Europe, it left traces in poetry, in legal records, in scandalous court cases, and in the whisper-thin margins of letters exchanged between monks who used just enough Latin to sound spiritual and just enough longing to sound like something else. Let's get something out of the way early. Did the church approve of same-sex relationships? Absolutely not. The church categorized same-sex acts under the wide umbrella of sodomy, a term which at the time covered not just one thing, but a whole buffet of what was considered unnatural behavior. That could include everything from consensual intimacy between two men to certain heterosexual acts that weren't strictly for reproduction. The message was clear: anything outside the narrowest view of God-sanctioned marital intimacy was sinful. But here's the twist. Real life wasn't that simple. Start with the monasteries. Picture rows of stone cells, nightly prayers, candlelit manuscripts, and quiet companionship. In these all-male environments where emotional bonds were strong and physical privacy was limited, close relationships developed. Some were purely fraternal. Others, historians still debate. We have letters between monks that express deep affection, longing even. They write of aching for each other's company of sleepless nights, thinking about a particular brother's absence of joy that comes only in your presence. While these writings are couched in spiritual language, they carry an emotional weight that feels intimate. And what about convents? All-female communities often fostered intense bonds between nuns, spiritual friendships that sometimes went beyond shared prayer. Letters from medieval women to each other include endearments, declarations of exclusivity, and even references to kissing. Again, scholars argue whether these were expressions of platonic love or coded romance. The truth is probably both. Emotions don't always fit neatly into categories, especially not when you're living under vows with the outside world shut out and Sister Beatrice smells like lavender and candle wax. Outside religious life, same-sex attraction still appeared more quietly and often more dangerously. Among nobles where marriages were arranged and emotional fulfillment could be rare, people sometimes sought connection elsewhere. There are stories of women who chose to remain unmarried and lived together in companionship, sometimes referred to by historians as Boston marriages, though, of course, no one in the 1300s had been to Boston. Among men, noble households sometimes hid relationships behind poetry and service, the young page devoted to his lord the squire, who never married the knight whose closest confidant was not his wife but a fellow soldier. Let's take a moment for a particularly odd fact in 14th century Florence. There were so many legal cases involving male-male intimacy that city officials created a special task force to track and prosecute it. Known as the Office of the Knight, they investigated rumors, interrogated suspects, and issued punishments ranging from fines to exile. But here's the twist. Their methods were often inconsistent, their evidence shaky, and their outcomes swayed by class. A poor apprentice might be punished severely. A wealthy noble might get a warning and a knowing glance. Justice, as always, was selectively applied. Despite the risks, same-sex relationships endured. Lovers found ways to meet during festivals in the anonymity of bathhouses or under the cover of spiritual guidance. Some used coded language, others simply relied on discretion. In a world where physical affection between people of the same sex was considered normal, men embracing women kissing cheeks, it was easier to hide in plain sight. Literature offers even more clues. Troubadour songs. Yes, those medieval ballads you thought were all about maidens and roses occasionally veer into male-to-male devotion. Female poets, too, sometimes addressed their verses to other women, blurring the line between friendship and flirtation. One 12th century French poem describes a woman dreaming of her beloved, another woman, with such tenderness that modern readers often blink and reread it twice. Historians still debate whether this was just poetry or something more, but love, as it turns out, doesn't care much for historical footnotes. As for terminology, there wasn't any. The modern concept of sexual identity didn't exist. You didn't come out. There were no parades, no categories, no neatly defined labels. People acted, loved, feared, and sometimes confessed, because that's what human beings have always done. In some cases, individuals were tried for unnatural acts. In others, they were quietly ignored. A monk might be transferred to another monastery. A noble might be sent abroad. A woman might be married off quickly. Her letters burned, her silence bought. And yet the stories remain. We find them in court documents, in margins of prayer books, in verses too lyrical to be platonic. We see them in art, the sidelong glances, the lingering hands, the devotional portraits that feel just a little too personal. History doesn't shout these stories, it whispers them, but they're there. There's one recorded case from 15th century England of two women who lived together as sisters for more than 20 years. Their neighbors suspected more, of course, but the women maintained that their relationship was spiritual. The local priest, unsure of how to proceed, simply suggested they pray more often but separately. It was perhaps the most diplomatic move of his career. And while medieval society did not embrace same-sex love, it couldn't completely erase it either. Love, real, messy, inconvenient love, has a way of surviving doctrine, dodging punishment, and slipping between the lines of rules written by people who thought they could outwit the human heart. So tonight, as your thoughts drift, imagine two people meeting in a chapel corridor cloaked in candlelight and silence. Imagine a hand brushing against another as they pass. Imagine the glances, the pause, too long to be accidental, the breath caught in the moment. There are no words. There is no safety. Only presence, only ache, and somehow across time it survives. Imagine for a moment you're a baker's wife in a modest medieval town. Your days are long, your hands are covered in flour, and your husband, let's call him Bernard, has been acting strange. He's staying out late, whispering too much, smiling at the miller's daughter a bit longer than a man with sore knees should. You start asking questions. The neighbors begin to nod solemnly, and one day you find yourself not baking bread, but standing in the church courtyard staring down your husband, while the priest reads aloud the charge adultery. In medieval Europe, cheating wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a legal and social offense, and like most things in that era, it was wrapped in layers of law, gossip, religion, and occasionally livestock penalties. Marriage, you see, wasn't only a spiritual union, it was a contract, a business agreement, a public institution that affected inheritance, dowries, property rights, and social order. When someone committed adultery, they weren't just breaking hearts, they were threatening the entire economic and familial structure. Who fathered which child wasn't a matter of private drama. It could decide who inherited the land, the title, or the cow. Let's start with the women. A married woman caught in an affair faced swift and brutal consequences. She could lose her dowry, be publicly shamed, and in some cases legally punished. Public penance was common. She might be forced to wear a special garment, confess at mass, or even be paraded through the streets holding a sign, or worse, holding nothing at all. There's a particularly infamous case of a noblewoman in Burgundy who was caught with her husband's squire. She was forced to walk barefoot through the village wearing only her chemise while villagers threw cabbage leaves at her. One assumes they weren't the fresh kind. Sometimes, if the affair was particularly scandalous or produced a child, the consequences extended to annulments or exile. A woman could be cast out from her family, her home, and her social standing. And all of this happened under the watchful gaze of the community whose collective memory was longer than a winter's fast. Men, of course, got a longer leash. A married man caught cheating might be fined or gently scolded by the priest, especially if his partner was unmarried. If he was wealthy or influential, the issue might be quietly resolved with a donation to the church or a hasty marriage arranged for the woman in question. One bishop wrote in the 14th century that a man's dalliance was regrettable, but understandable. The same bishop later excommunicated a woman for doing the same, citing moral corruption. Historians still debate whether this was hypocrisy or simply standard issue double standards. Still, not all adulterous men got off easily. In some towns, adultery carried financial penalties for both parties. The man might be ordered to compensate the husband of the woman he'd slept with, either in coin livestock or occasionally land. There are documented cases where the price for adultery was one ox and the public confession. Another required the man to pay for the repair of a church bell because, as the judge stated, if you disturb the moral order, you shall restore the sacred chime. Odd fact break, in a few medieval Italian cities, adultery fines were adjusted based on the social rank of the person you'd slept with. Sleep with a noblewoman. That'll cost you double. Sleep with a servant. Slightly less, but still frowned upon. Sleep with a nun. We're not even going to talk about what that cost. But the real danger of adultery wasn't always legal. It was personal. Husbands who discovered their wives had strayed could in certain contexts take appropriate action, which in the language of medieval law was vague and violent. Honor killings, while not encouraged, weren't always punished either. A man of standing might kill his wife's lover and be excused on the grounds of defending his household. A nobleman might have his wife quietly retired to a convent or shipped off to live with distant relatives who raised sheep and didn't ask questions. Among the wealthy, adultery could spark a political crisis. If a noblewoman gave birth to a child suspected of being fathered by someone other than her husband, it could ignite inheritance disputes that stretched for generations. There are court cases, letters, and even battlefield skirmishes that trace their roots back to a single whispered rumor of infidelity. The stakes were high, the fallout was lasting. Among peasants, things were handled with more immediacy. Adultery might be punished with a fine, a forced apology, or most commonly permanent inclusion in village gossip. Your name would become shorthand. Don't go pulling a Marjorie, they'd say, shaking their heads by the well. If things got bad enough, families might move to another village entirely just to escape the echo of one bad decision. But here's the nuance. Despite the drama, the rules weren't always enforced. If no pregnancy occurred, if no one made a formal accusation, if the community preferred to look the other way, then things stayed quiet. Adultery was like mildew on a stone wall, unpleasant but often ignored until it became a structural problem, and it wasn't always about passion. Sometimes affairs were strategic. A noblewoman might seek an alliance outside her marriage. A merchant's wife might take comfort during her husband's long absences. A servant girl might be coerced. The motivations were varied, the outcomes unpredictable. Some affairs were brief sparks. Others were long-burning secrets. A few even ended with elopement, much to the horror of both families. Still, for every scandal that reached the court record, a dozen others simmered in silence. Some were quietly forgiven, others became legends. A man once carved a heart into the door of his lover's house, and the townsfolk, not knowing who the lover was, spent 3 winters speculating. The baker, the reeve, the man who owned exactly 4 pigs and always smiled too much. No one ever found out. But the heart stayed weathered and fading, a footnote carved in oak. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift off, think of those tangled loves. The secrets exchanged in candlelight, the jealous glances across feast tables, the heavy weight of reputation, and the fragile dance of desire and discretion. Because even in a world ruled by law and God and cabbage-wielding villagers, people still made mistakes. They still loved wrongly. They still tried again. And in the end, the heart flawed fickle and deeply human beat on. So far, we've seen that love in the Middle Ages came with a lot of rules and even more people watching to make sure you followed them. But among all those rules, perhaps none were more layered or more deeply confusing than the idea of consent. Because while medieval law acknowledged it, and the church had plenty to say about it, the way it worked in practice was messy. Sometimes progressive, often problematic, and always tangled in power, property, and pressure. Let's begin with the strange but true fact: medieval canon law did recognize consent as essential to marriage. That's right. In the eyes of the church, a couple could marry simply by exchanging words of agreement, verba de presenti, in private, with no priest, no witnesses, no elaborate ceremony. Say I will to each other, and poof, you're married. This made for some very awkward court cases when people tried to deny they'd ever made such promises, while their ex-sweetheart stood there saying, yes, you did. Behind the granary, you were very sincere. This idea was actually somewhat radical. In a time when women's lives were mostly governed by fathers, brothers, and husbands, the notion that a woman's verbal consent mattered was a big deal. But before we declare medieval Europe a feminist utopia, let's dig a little deeper. Because legal theory and lived reality rarely matched. Take noblewomen, for example. Yes, their consent was technically required for marriage, but in practice, their matches were arranged like military alliances. Their fathers negotiated with other noblemen, promising daughters like chess pieces, pawns, to be moved often without being consulted. Sometimes a girl might be asked her opinion after the contracts were signed. If she resisted, she risked angering her family or losing her inheritance. If she agreed, she might be praised for her virtue and quietly ignored from then on. One famous case tells of a 13-year-old noblewoman who refused to marry the man chosen for her. She was locked in a tower for several months until she changed her mind. When she finally emerged, newly compliant, the priest performed the ceremony that same day. Her consent had been acquired technically, but freely given, historians still debate it. Among peasants, things could be a little more flexible, but not always easier. Social pressure still loomed large. Saying no to a marriage proposal wasn't just about disappointing your suitor. It could mean angering his family, upsetting your parents, and losing your standing in the community. Refusing a match might be seen as stubborn, ungrateful, or suspicious. And if your would-be husband was the Reeves' son, or your father's landlord's cousin, saying no could turn dangerous. Once inside marriage, things became even more complicated. Married couples were said to owe each other the marital debt. This was not financial, it was physical. Intimacy was seen as a duty. A wife could not deny her husband without risking legal or spiritual consequences. And the same theoretically went for husbands. But again, theory bowed to power. A man could demand his wife repay the debt at any time. If she refused, he could appeal to the priest or even bring her to court. There are records of wives being accused of withholding marital rights, and in some cases being punished for it. And here's where it gets more uncomfortable. The idea of marital rape simply did not exist in medieval law. A husband was seen as having permanent access to his wife's body. Once married, her consent was presumed always. If she was unwilling, it was considered a matter of spiritual concern, not legal violation. The church might advise him to be gentle, to pray, to seek harmony. But ultimately, he had the right. Still, the picture wasn't entirely bleak. In some urban centers, particularly in late medieval England and parts of France, women did bring cases of coercion and violence to court. Sometimes they won. If a woman could prove she had been tricked into marriage or forced against her will, the marriage could be annulled. If she could show evidence of abuse, bruises, witness accounts, or a priest willing to testify, her husband might be fined, excommunicated, or ordered to provide separate living quarters. There's a fascinating case from 15th century London where a woman claimed her husband had beaten her and taken her against her will. The court surprisingly ruled in her favor. He was fined and told to seek reconciliation or sleep elsewhere. It wasn't justice as we might hope for it today, but it was something. Odd fact break, in some towns there were specific days when couples were discouraged from being intimate, not just for religious reasons, but because local officials believed it caused arguments. Wednesdays apparently were considered emotionally unstable. Historians still don't know why. Perhaps someone in authority just had a bad breakup on a Wednesday. Consent, then, was a strange shape in the medieval mind. It existed in writing in church doctrine and occasionally in courtrooms. But it was constantly shaped by class, gender, and power. A wealthy woman might have her feelings acknowledged. A peasant girl might have hers ignored. A man might be excused for acting rashly. A woman, never. And yet amidst all this, people still made choices. Some resisted forced marriages, some ran away, some negotiated for better terms. There are stories, rare but real, of women refusing matches and succeeding, of couples marrying for love with no dowry involved, of townsfolk backing a girl who said no, standing by her until her parents relented. In one village, a young woman refused 3 suitors, each more insistent than the last. Her family despaired. The priest gave sermons. The neighbors gossiped. And still, she held her ground. Finally, she married a kind-hearted weaver who had never dared to propose. They lived by all accounts quietly and happily. Her name doesn't appear in moral rolls or court records. Just a footnote in a local ledger: Marjorie, wife of Thomas, gave bread to the poor during the winter of the famine. Perhaps that was consent in its purest form, not shouted but lived. So tonight, as you rest in a world that still grapples with consent, remember the women who whispered no into winds that barely listened, the men who asked before touching, the courts that sometimes believed, the few rare moments when dignity prevailed. It wasn't enough, but it mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that's how change begins, in quiet resistance and in love that waits for a yes. By now you might be wondering, with all the rules, guilt and public shaming, did anyone in medieval Europe actually manage to feel good about intimacy? The short answer, not if the church had anything to say about it. Because when it came to physical pleasure, even within the sanctity of marriage, the medieval church took the scenic route straight to suspicion. Intimacy wasn't celebrated, encouraged, or even quietly respected. It was tolerated. Barely. The only reason a married couple could come together at all, according to most theological manuals, was for procreation. Babies were the goal, affection if you were lucky, joy absolutely not. Let's start with the basic theology. Medieval Christianity, especially after the influence of thinkers like St. Augustine and St. Jerome, saw the body as a battlefield, flesh versus spirit, passion versus purity. And any physical desire, even for one's spouse, was viewed as a potential danger to the soul. At best, sex was a necessary function. At worst, it was a spiritual liability with a pulse. Church-approved intimacy came with a checklist: married check, intending children check, missionary position only check, no feast days, fast days, or Sunday mornings check, doing this while frowning and thinking about the sin of Adam also check. Anything outside those bounds, desire for pleasure, emotional intensity, physical creativity, was suspect. Many theologians warned that too much enjoyment even between spouses could stain the soul. Some even suggested that marital intimacy was only truly sinless when it was joyless. One famous guidebook for confessors warned priests to ask married parishioners whether they had rejoiced too freely in their union. In other words, were you having fun? Because if so, you might need extra penance. Even within marriage, lust was a problem. If a husband found his wife attractive, that was acceptable so long as he didn't like it too much. A wife likewise could express affection. But if she became too eager, too expressive, or heaven forbid, initiated things, she risked being labeled immodest. There's a record of one bishop who scolded a wife for climbing upon her husband's embrace with an excess of zeal. I'll let you imagine what that means. This attitude trickled down into popular culture. Love poems were often about unrequited longing. Saints were praised for their chastity. The most virtuous married couples were those who eventually matured into celibacy. That's right, couples who decided after years of marriage and childbearing to abstain entirely were considered spiritually superior. A sort of holiness through boredom. There are letters from husbands writing to their wives expressing pride that they had both conquered the flesh. One man declared, "We no longer need to embrace, for we have embraced the Lord instead." It's not exactly pillow talk. And yet, beneath all that spiritual pressure, human nature still breathed. Many couples quietly ignored the church's warnings. Peasants in particular had little time for theological hair-splitting. Their lives were ruled by seasons, livestock illness, and hunger, not by Latin homilies about the dangers of winking. If affection bloomed during a quiet night after the children had fallen asleep, it likely did so without much worry about whether it was Tuesday or a minor saint's feast. Even among the clergy, things were inconsistent. While monks and nuns were supposed to be celibate, and priests were expected to remain chaste, there's ample evidence that many struggled. Some had mistresses, others fathered children, a few confessed. Others simply moved parishes and hoped no one brought it up. One odd fact, in some parts of Europe it was common knowledge which priests were safe to confess to if your sins involved marital intimacy. These were the ones less likely to ask invasive questions or prescribe 40 days of fasting just because you smiled during a kiss. Among the nobility, the church's influence was stronger. Confessors often served as spiritual advisors, shadowing couples and offering moral guidance. In some cases, they even lived in the household, subtly monitoring behavior. One nobleman wrote that his chaplain helped us toward holiness by interrupting our evenings with readings from the Psalms. You can imagine how well that went over. despite all this love, still happened. People still held hands, they still whispered across firelight. They still felt the tug of affection, even when the sermons warned against it. And some quietly, cautiously decided not to feel guilty about it. There's a beautiful letter from a 14th century husband to his wife, written during a time of separation. In it he writes, "When I return to you, I do not wish only to see your face, but to hold you as I did before we prayed to be worthy of each other. There is no shame in his words, no fear, just love shaped by faith, but not strangled by it." Historians still debate whether the Church's teachings truly reflected the lived experiences of most couples. Some argue that people internalized the guilt that they suffered spiritually from the disconnect between desire and doctrine. Others believe that medieval people were pragmatic, that they nodded along at church, then went home and did what felt right. Either way, the pressure was there. The fear that too much joy could open the door to sin. That pleasure, however brief, came with a cost, and yet love remained. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, picture not the cold, silent rooms of saintly abstinence, but the warmth of a shared blanket, the quiet laughter of a couple who've been together long enough to ignore the sermon, the hand that reaches across straw and wool, not out of duty but affection. In a world where pleasure was policed, choosing to feel it anyway was an act of quiet rebellion. And in that rebellion, perhaps, lay something holy. After all that, after the scrolls, the sins, the sermons, and the suspicious goats, you may be wondering, did people in medieval Europe actually fall in love? Not the arranged kind. Not the dowry-fueled livestock-swapping, politically convenient kind, but real love, tender, awkward, flutter-in-your-stomach love. The answer whispered through poems and preserved in court records is yes. Yes, they did, despite everything. Let's start with the peasants, the bakers and weavers, shepherds and brewers who might not have had fancy linens or family crests, but had fields to walk, market stalls to flirt beside, and feast days where dancing was allowed. There are records of couples eloping, defying their parents' plans, marrying for affection rather than advantage. One particularly charming court record from northern England documents a girl who refused 3 suitors before choosing a gentle-eyed man with a crooked smile who brought her apples from his own orchard. That's not a power play. That's love. Among the middle classes, especially in the growing towns of the 14th and 15th centuries, more autonomy in marriage choices appeared. As trade expanded and social mobility increased, so too did the opportunities to marry for companionship. Merchants' daughters could meet journeymen. Apprentices could write poetry to seamstresses, and occasionally parents even allowed matches based on affection, so long as the ledger still balanced. And what about the nobility? Well, yes, it was mostly about land, lineage, and strategy. But even there, love sometimes found a crack in the marble. Poets at court didn't just compose verses about distant ladies for fun. Troubadours risked exile or worse for songs that revealed too much. Knights wore tokens into battle not because they had to, but because they cared. There's a record of a French noblewoman who secretly taught herself to write just to send letters to a squire she wasn't allowed to marry. The squire later disappeared in battle. Her last letter was never delivered, but the parchment remains, now faded, her words tender and misspelled. Some medieval marriages, even among nobles, started with affection but ended in saintly friendship. Couples who lived together, prayed together, and eventually decided to give up intimacy altogether in pursuit of spiritual harmony. Were they happy? Some clearly were. Others perhaps simply found peace in routine and loyalty. Love doesn't always come in a blaze. Sometimes it simmers quiet, slow, and lasting. Literature offers more. Courtly love, that idealized, often tragic longing sung about in castles and carved into oak panels, was more than a poetic device. It was a way to express what couldn't be lived out loud. A knight writing to a married noblewoman wasn't just performing, it was often the only way he could speak honestly. A married lady exchanging verses with a traveling bard wasn't necessarily unfaithful. She was reaching for beauty in a world that gave her none. Even in cloisters and monasteries, love flickered. Letters exchanged between monks speak of longing. Nuns wrote to one another with deep affection, some pledging lifelong spiritual companionship. The boundary between spiritual love and romantic devotion blurred in ink and silence. Modern scholars still debate, was it platonic, was it coded, or was it simply human? And here's the tenderest truth of all. Not every medieval marriage was loveless. Many began in arrangement and grew into affection. Couples who survived plagues, harsh winters, child loss, and poor harvests together often built a bond that went beyond obligation. They worked side by side, shared beds, meals, and moments of peace, raised children, faced taxes, argued over pigs. And through all that, they built something we might recognize not just duty but love. One merchant's diary, preserved almost by accident, records him buying a ribbon for his wife because she looked sad in the morning light. He doesn't say anything else. He didn't need to. And even in loss, love endured. Widows wrote to deceased husbands, kept their clothes folded on benches, whispered prayers for their souls every night. Some remarried for practicality. Others never did. Not out of grief, but because they had loved enough once. So tonight, as you close your eyes and listen to the quiet hum of your room, know this love did exist then. Not always in the ways we expect. Sometimes in glances, sometimes in letters, sometimes in a shared bowl of broth at the end of a long day. The world may have been colder, stricter, louder, with judgment. But love, as it always does, found places to hide. In corners of cottages, behind garden walls, between verses, beneath wool blankets in the deep of winter. And it's still here. Now everything slows. The fire burns low. The hay has settled and the goats, yes, even the nosy ones have stopped rustling in the shadows. The bells have long since rung. The priest has gone to bed. The neighbors' windows are dark. And you, drifting now, lie nestled in this quiet medieval dream where the world moves gently and the noise fades to hush. What strange, tender creatures we are, creating rules for love, punishing joy, whispering under our breath when hearts beat too fast, and yet always, always trying to find each other. This story was never really about chastity belts or public penance confessional checklists or illicit hayloft kisses. It was about that ancient stubborn pull, the one that survives sermons and scandal, the one that tiptoes past watchful eyes, slips behind hedges, tucks a note into a sleeve. That wild, patient thing called love. It doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't care if it's lent. You've walked through centuries tonight, through stone chapels and muddy lanes, noble halls and crowded cottages. You've watched couples risk everything for a moment of warmth. You've seen fear, rules, tenderness, and hope, all of it still lingering in the quiet. So take one last breath. Let the stillness settle. There is nothing more to figure out. Just rest now. Let the past hold you gently. Let the story fade. You are warm. You are safe. You are loved. Good night.